Hello there, this is Michael Elder, and it's good to be back together. This is our second session really focused on multiplication, and we move into times 2 and times 10. Originally I was going to put this together as one big video, but I'm going to separate them out just so it's a little easier for you to manage. So this section is going to be just on multiplying by 2, and then I'll post a second video on the second chapter that goes with this session this week. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to remind us that when we were last together, we talked about our foundational facts and that we would be starting with the facts and we would be going through them in this order. So our first one is times 2, and we see that kind of the overarching premise is here on our chart, that we really are focusing a lot on skip counting by 2s and then groups of 2s or pairs and connecting that to doubling. So we'll look at that here in just a moment. We're going to look at a number of games to help build automaticity. We're going to talk about automaticity and then ultimately kind of close up with how do we assess kids' progress and those things that are always a big part of multiplication facts. So let's jump right into it here. So as we begin this session, we ask the question, what do you think of when you hear multiplying by 2? And we also ask, what kind of experiences do our kids have? The ones that come to us already knowing multiples by or multiplying by 2, they just get it, they understand how it works. Not just they know the answers, but they just really understand it. What kind of things do they know? We may have hinted to those, or I may have hinted to those just a minute ago, but you might have thought in terms of pre-assessing kids that there are certain things they're going to show you, right? They might show you that they can identify doubles. They understand that when you're saying 4 times 2, that's doubling 4, and so that must be, well, 4 and 4 makes 8. Or they may even picture 4 times 2 makes 8. They may also know pairs. They may know that if I put 2 of this with 2 of that, then I get 4 of something, or I can see 8 apples over here and 8 apples over there. So if we put the pairs together, then they do this thing that we talk about as doubling. When kids recognize that, we know that they have the concept of times 2, not just that it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on. So our big ideas of multiplying by 2 go something like this. Hit on this one already, right? That multiplying by 2, it's not a trick. There's not just they make these nice convenient numbers, they're pretty, all those things. Those things may be true, but they're not tricks, right? That multiplying by 2 truly is doubling something. We look at the idea that numbers stand for a whole bunch of different things, and then we have these operation symbols. So at some point we're introducing kids to this idea that the X now starts to stand for multiplication. Later in grades it's the asterisk, and then it becomes the dot, right? But these are just symbols that mean groups of or something similar to that. And they also tell us something about the numbers in a group. We know that one of the big ideas in multiplication period is that all of our multiplication is based on the idea that our number system ties back to patterning. And so if we can recognize the patterns in certain number situations, we can not only predict what comes next, but we can start to remember easier and make it easier for us to remember. Some of the things we notice with 2s, of course, with kids are that when you multiply by 2, that those are always even. And we'll look at why that is later and see if our kids can figure that out for us too. And then finally, that when we multiply, the order of the values doesn't matter when it comes to finding the value. It doesn't change the product. It does mean something different, and we'll look at that here in a little bit, but it doesn't change the value of the equation or the value of the statement. So whether you're, like the example here, whether you're visualizing 2 times 5 as 2 groups of 5 or 5 groups of 2 may or may not matter. However, there are times when we're really talking about 2 groups of 5, and that's different than talking about 5 groups of 2. So we'll look at all those things here as we go through today, but it's good to just step back from the facts for a minute and look at what are our big ideas. So let's jump in. Each one of our chapters here in our book begins with story. And so in our literature today, the story is Two of Everything, which I assume many of you are probably familiar with. Two of Everything was written by Lily Toy Hong. If you don't have a copy of the book, it's pretty prevalent in our libraries. I looked in Destiny. I saw it in a lot of our school libraries. If you don't have access to it there, I can tell you how I got mine. I went on Amazon, and for all of 1 penny, plus the shipping, I was able to get the copy of the book. It's in my personal collection somewhere, but couldn't find it, so we go ahead and order one from Amazon. So now we've got it set for this professional development. So some of the questions we might ask as we prepare for this, for reading the book, if we are working with kids, because it's always good to think about before reading, during reading, and after reading parts of this. We might ask things like that are here on the screen, like, have you ever really just wanted twice as much of something? Have you ever just wanted 2 scoops of ice cream? Well, how is 2 scoops of ice cream different than 1 scoop of ice cream? Or how is 4 scoops different than 2? Thinking about giving kids chances to draw out, what do I mean when I say twice as much? If I'm going to give you twice as much homework, what does that mean? If I'm going to give you twice as much money, what does that mean? And is that the same as doubling? So in this story, we're going to read this together here now. When we read the story, we're looking at a couple here who finds a magic pot, and in the magic pot, it doubles everything that they have. So as we read this, we want you to think about, what are some of the things you would want to put in the pot? I know for me, there would be some dollar bills laying in there. So let me switch over here to our story. And again, this is Two of Everything by Lily Toy Hong. Let me scooch that up just a little bit, so I think that'll be readable for us. So I apologize flipping back and forth. This is based on a Chinese folk tale. So the story goes something like this. Once, long ago, in a little hut, lived Mrs. Hacktack and Mr. Hacktack and his wife, Mrs. Hacktack. They were old and they were very poor. But what little they got to eat came from their very tiny garden. In a lucky year, when the harvest was plentiful, Mr. Hacktack had a little extra to take to the village. There he traded turnips, potatoes, and other vegetables for clothing, lamp oil, and some fresh seeds. One spring, when Mr. Hacktack was digging in his garden, his shovel struck something very hard. Puzzled, he dug deeper into the dark ground until he came upon an ancient pot made of brass. "Oh, how odd," said Mr. Hacktack to himself. "To think I have been digging here all these years, and I never came across this pot before. I'll take it home. Maybe Mrs. Hacktack can find some use for it." You see it pulling it out of the soil there. The pot was big, and it was heavy for old Mr. Hacktack. As he stumbled along, his purse, which contained his last 5 gold coins, fell to the ground. So he tossed it into the pot for safekeeping, and he staggered on home. His wife greeted him at the door. "Dear husband, what a strange pot!" Mr. Hacktack explained how he had found the pot. "I wonder what we can do with it," said Mrs. Hacktack. "It looks too large to cook in, and it's too small to bathe in." As Mrs. Hacktack leaned over to peer into the pot, her hairpin, the only one she owned, fell in. She felt around in the pot, and suddenly her eyes grew round with surprise. "Look!" she shouted. "I pulled out 2 hairpins, exactly alike, and 2 purses, too." Sure enough, the purses were identical, and so were the hairpins. Inside each purse were 5 gold coins. Mr. Hacktack was so excited he jumped up and down. "Let's put my winter coat inside the pot. If we're lucky again, the pot will make 2 coats, and then we'll both stay warm." So into the pot went 1 coat, and out came 2 coats. They began to search the house and quickly put more and more things into the magical pot. "If only we had some meat," wished Mr. Hacktack, "or fresh fruit, or 1 delicious sweet cake." Mr. Hacktack smiled. "I know how we can get anything we want," she said. She put their 10 coins into 1 purse, and she threw it into the pot. She pulled out 2 purses with 10 coins in each one. "What a clever wife I have!" cried Mr. Hack-Tack. "Each time we do this, we'll have twice as much money as we had before." The Hack-Tacks worked late into the night, filling and emptying the pot until the floor was covered with coins. Morning came, and off went Mr. Hack-Tack with a long list of things to buy in the village. Instead of vegetables, his basket was full of gold coins. Mrs. Hack-Tack finished all of her chores and sat down to enjoy a cup of tea. She sipped her tea and admired the brass pot. And then with a grateful heart she knelt and she embraced it. "Dear pot, I don't know where you came from, but you are my best friend." She stood over the pot to look inside. At that very moment Mr. Hack-Tack returned. His arms were so full that he had to kick the door open. Bang! Mrs. Hack-Tack was so startled that she lost her balance, and she fell head first into the pot. Mr. Hack-Tack ran over and grabbed his wife's legs. She pulled and tugged until she slid onto the floor. But when she looked into the pot again, he gasped. 2 more legs were sticking straight out of it. Naturally, he took hold of the ankles and pulled, and out came a second person. She looked exactly like his wife. The new Mrs. Hack-Tack sat silently on the floor looking lost. But the first time Mrs. Hack-Tack cried, "I am your one and only wife. Put that woman back into the pot right now." Mr. Hack-Tack yelled, "No! If I put her back in, we won't have 2 women but 3. 1 wife is enough for me." He backed away from his angry wife and tripped and fell head first into the pot himself. Both Mrs. Hack-Tacks rushed to rescue him. Each grasped an ankle, and together they pulled him out. There were 2 more legs in the pot now, so they pulled out the other Mr. Hack-Tack too. "Just what use does one Mr. Hack-Tack have for another?" Mr. Hack-Tack cried angrily. "This pot is not as wonderful as we thought it was. Now even our troubles are beginning to double." But his wife had been thinking while he was yelling. "Calm down," she said. "It's good that the other Mrs. Hack-Tack has her own Mr. Hack-Tack. Perhaps we'll become the best of friends. After all, we're all so alike. He will be a brother to you, and she will be a sister to me. With our pot we can make 2 of everything, so there will be plenty to go around." And that is exactly what they did. The Hack-Tacks built 2 fine new homes, and each house had 2 identical teapots, rice bowls, silk embroideries, and bamboo furniture. From the outside, the houses looked exactly alike, but there was one difference. Hidden in one house was a big brass pot. Of course, the Hack-Tacks were always careful, very careful, not to fall into it again. The new Hack-Tacks and the old Hack-Tacks did become good friends. The neighbors thought that the Hack-Tacks had grown so rich they decided to have 2 of everything, even themselves. And that is the end of our story. So I hope it gave us a chance to see the book. If you have seen it already, then this is certainly a repeated experience for you, and that's good. So we go back to our original question, right, which was, what would you like to put into the pot? Are there certain things that you might have anticipated happening in the story? Maybe some of the questions like, would you have kept the pot after the accident? So as we read, one of the things we have to be careful as we're pulling literature into math is that we're remembering that the first time reading through a text, it's very tempting, especially for those of us in the teaching role. We've read the book before, we know where it goes, we know what's coming up next, and those are certainly important when we're teaching. But we need to allow kids to have that first experience with a text too. So you notice as I read it, we didn't stop each time and talk about how many coins were in the purse and what would happen if it happened again, because we want to allow kids that opportunity to just appreciate the literature first. And then we'll get into, okay, so now I've got you into the math. Let's talk about where the math is in this story. So I've seen this story used with kids from 2nd grade all the way through 5th grade. Fifth graders have a different sense of humor about it than second graders do, but there typically is an awful lot of laughing when it comes to the Two of Everything book. So it's good to pause and do some prediction, but just don't fall into what can be a little bit of a trap, in that it's easy to stop when we're reading literature and ruin the story by pausing and making it all about the math right at first. So we're going to go into how we would use this, but that's just kind of maybe some words of caution. So let's look at some after reading some of the questions, right? So some of the things we might chart out, some of the things we might ask kids to think through, right? What did double in this story? So we would remember there were things from the beginning to the end: the hairpin, the purse. Obviously, by the end of the story, they had doubled everything in their house. So we could talk about how much would have been in their house to begin with and how much at the end. So you can see where the size of the doubling could be much larger for older kids than it would be for younger kids. But it's still the same process, right? We talked about the number of coins that went into the pot, how many were taken out, would they be the same? How many would be left in the pot when you took one bag out, those kind of things. So all those are activities you can certainly build in a second read or coming back to this. Tying to what kids know is always important when we're teaching. We all know that. Looking at something like, can we find twice as much by adding? So if I'm not really there with multiplication yet, it's okay to say, well, what did he start with? Well, 5 coins and 5 more coins. Well, how do I write that as a number sentence? Not jumping right to the abstract, but connecting the picture and maybe even the concrete, right? Maybe actually having five coins or 5 2-color counters. And then also how do we connect that? So over time we're going from, can we make twice as much by adding? And can we then get to, can we make twice as much by multiplying? And noticing how those two number sentences relate, but they look a little different. So let's look at the gold coin doubling activity. These sheets, again, if you decide that you would like the multiplication book, you have downloads of all these, and so you can grab it here off the screen, I suppose, if you wanted to use it right away. But you have downloads of these. If you decide that this is the book that you want, you'll have that access code. You can get any of these handouts, and there's also more. So this is simply an activity for kids to practice with 2-color counters. They could certainly use number cubes or anything, or just Unifix cubes or anything like that. So if there are this many coins in a bag, then how many coins would come out? So you can see the directions here to choose a coin bag. So they're going to grab one of the bags. If you'd like to prepare those in advance, that's the way they suggest in the text. Show which bag, so then they'd write down which bag they chose, right? They'd count the number in there, and then how many would they have if they doubled them? They'd write the addition sentence and then practice writing the multiplication sentence. So trying to get that connection that we can write this as addition, and that might be more comfortable. And then what do multiplication sentences start to look like when we're doubling? And obviously for us, we know they're all going to be something times 2 or something, and just writing it out x2, right? But for a kid, that's going to be a process of learning. So as we continue to use the text, we want to keep coming back, and some of the pictures that they use in the actual multiplication facts book really make this plain and clear, that having kids draw it out, draw the bags of coins, draw the examples here, draw the 6 roses and 6 more, and then how do I write that as an addition sentence, as a multiplication sentence, really starts to equip kids to be able to write their own number sentences or their own number stories. And we start getting away from the idea of problems and, oh my gosh, I don't like word problems because they're always tricky. The more we get kids to write their own word stories, their word problems, the more comfortable they are with them, just because they're, of course, completely used to those stories, and it's not a struggle for them. So we may model a couple together, right? So Mr. Hacktack wanted the special gift. He gets 6 roses from his garden. He puts them in the pot. What would that look like when they came out? They're making dinner, so now you see 2 things going into there: 3 corn muffins, 4 carrots. What would they take out? So can you draw it? Can you explain it? And then can you put it into number sentences? building then into kids writing their own story problems, which can very quickly become a classroom book that could look a lot like Two of Everything. So we'll look at that, I think, here in a minute too. At this point, we're focusing on pairs, right? So initially, we're thinking of doubling as something times 2. 1 hairpin goes in, 2 comes out. So that's 2 times something, right? So it's 2 groups of whatever. 2 groups of the 5 coins, 2 groups of the 6 roses, 2 groups of the 1 hairpin. But that's not the only way we think about pairs. Right? Another way we think about pairs is when the sets actually have 2 in them. So the example we use here, right, is Mrs. Short baked some yummy brownies. She put 6 plates on the table and 2 brownies on each plate. So she isn't doubling the number of plates, but we can use what we know about multiplication and doubling to solve this. Right? So we're going to have kids draw this out, right? They're going to thinking aloud through this. Kids give some very interesting takes on this, especially when they're first starting to try to make that connection between addition and multiplication. The clarification here that you might want to use this as a conversation that groups of 2 and 2 groups of 2, again, they may give you the same value, but they're not the same thing, right? So when I draw out the plates of brownies and I have my 6 plates drawn and I put my 2 brownies on each plate, that's very different, right? Then that's 6 groups of 2. 2 groups of 6 would look very different, and we could certainly draw that and talk about how it has the same number of brownies, the same value, but it isn't necessarily the same. So 2 little tweaks on pairs, right? One way, again, thinking about it as 2 groups of something, and then the other way thinking about groups of 2. That's, although it might seem somewhat simplistic, it's very important, especially when we get to start to talk about connecting to division, right? Because when I start dividing, I might be dividing it into 2 groups, or I might be dividing it into groups of 2, and I need to recognize that either way I can use what I know about multiplication to solve that. We also know that kids think about these things differently. So when we're doing the brownie task or the brownie question here, asking kids to draw out how they think through the problem is sometimes, or how they solve the problem. They may all draw 6 plates of 2 on it, and that would be great if they all drew that. That would be a good first step. But then how they decide that that's 12, some folks might be counting each brownie. Some folks might be going 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 and get their 12. And others might say, well, that's 6 groups of 2, so that's 6 times 2, and I know that's 12. The beauty of this kind of task is that it's easily repeatable, especially with young kids when they're first starting learning these. Writing their own situations becomes pretty comfortable. You do these with lots of different little snacks, and that's super fun, especially for us as adults, because then we get to have snacks. Wanted to just take a moment to say it's always good when we use a story like Two of Everything to come back to the story. Use the story again. Use it multiple times, to not simply use that story once and then say, well, okay, well, we read that book a while ago and then we put it away. Very good, especially for our struggling kids, to be able to come back and try to keep making that connection to what happens when you put this into the pot and you get 2 of it. It's a little bit more concrete, a little more memorable perhaps, than simply saying, come on, times 2 is, double it. So helping kids build that picture in their mind, I think, is key to them being able to retain these things, and especially as we move forward. Because we know we're going to use our doubling and our times 2s to find our times 3s and to find our times 4s. So making sure we get this strong foundation in 2s is absolutely critical. So let's move into, well, not quite yet. I was going to say let's move into the games, but that's coming up. So one of the other pieces that over time, and again, this is not one lesson. I hope this doesn't seem like this is all happening in one day. This is certainly happening over a period of time. That we want kids to start looking at, what patterns do you see? Most kids, if they get this sheet, are going to probably just write down, if they know them, they're going to put down 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, right? They're going to go right down through the list, and they're going to be done. that's great, but what we want for them to do is to look at the observations. What are you noticing here? Are they picking out that each one of these has 2 as a factor? Do they notice that it can be done by counting by 2s, that you can do it iteratively by adding 2 to the previous one? So as we think through the working with doubles and working with pairs, making sure that kids notice that this is a series of patterns, right? So we get back to our big ideas with numbers in general, is that math is based upon patterns and that we can be pretty predictable about things. So hopefully this is one way we get kids to look at that. Maybe these are some things we chart out that we put up. So again, that we're comparing when we get to times 3s and times 4s. How do doubles help us solve those questions, right? Because we start to see some times 4s and some times 3s in here. And so we'll hit those certainly when we get to those values. When we mentioned a couple times already about the commutative property, right? So having kids rewrite this chart, or looking at it, if we flip them around, would that change the values? Would there still be a pattern? Does the pattern remain the same? Hopefully over time they begin to realize it does, but that isn't necessarily the first thing that kids pick up. And then there's that question about evens and odds, which is always interesting when you're working with kids. Do they realize that when you're multiplying by 2, not so much that they're all even, although that's a first realization, but why are they all even? Like, what's really going on? Why can I multiply 2 times an even number and get an even number? And if I take 2 times an odd number, why does that create an even number? Because those are the things that, again, create more and more connections in the brain for our kids later to be able to come back and remember these things. So when we're doing this, or we're asking kids to think about even and odd, it's certainly important to give them some manipulatives, let them see that if I have 3 of this item and 3 of that item, when I start bringing those together, I have my pairs, right? These 2 are pairs. And then these middle ones, anytime I multiply by 2, I have that one lonely one over here and the one lonely one over there, and that creates an additional pair. So it doesn't matter whether I had an even number and I have 4 and 4, well, now they just kind of all pair up. Or if I just had 1 and 1, right? There's always, when I do odd numbers, there's always that lonely or that individual left out. So those 2 come together when I multiply by 2, because that's what happens. I get 1 of each, right? And that's what times 2 means. That is not a realization that kids get the very first time. Oftentimes it's one of those realizations even as adults that folks will pick up on later and say, that's why that works. So giving kids a myriad of opportunities to look at the commutative property, what would it look like if I have 2 baskets with 3 apples, or 3 baskets with 2 apples? And if I just have 6 apples, does that work for both of these? And again, these are easy ones for kids to rewrite. They're great situations, great teach-backs for kids to start a lesson. I want you to create a commutative property story for us for tomorrow, one that works and one that doesn't work. Because sometimes they can come up with one where they'll change the value in there and show that commutative property doesn't mean we can just switch around any numbers. It has to be the same 2 values in there. So we talked about writing stories, creating class books. These can certainly tie to other content areas. There are definitely some cute versions of 2 of everything out there written by some of our younger kids. Again, sometimes we want to tie it to a theme or something else we're learning about. If we're learning about certain types of animals, then we're going to put those in our book. We're going to write a book about 2 of something else, 2 types of animals. If we're learning about plants, maybe you're going to pick out your favorite plant, and we start with one and another one grows. So definitely some creative ways you can work it in, and keep bringing it back to, hey, remember how that story kind of gave us a concept of doubling and times 2? But ultimately we get to this, right, which is automaticity, right? We chatted at the very beginning, or actually in some of the previous sessions, about the difference between being automatic with something and memorizing something. So we want to make sure that our kids have a concept, that concept is rooted in something, and they can go back and access that. So building it after they've got an understanding of what doubling is and what pairs are, and we can flip them around, then it's okay to start building automaticity. Right? Generally speaking, we might call this targeted practice, but it needs to be short It needs to be routine, which means it doesn't just happen at the beginning of the year or the end of the year or once a month or something. It needs to be something that happens probably on a weekly basis. A daily basis might be a little bit too much for most kids. You're not going to see that much growth from day to day, and that level of repetition probably doesn't get you the growth that you think it might. And we need to bring in something that makes it more interesting than just flashcards, right? So we bring in the ideas of games, and DPI has building math fluency through games, and we're going to share 3 or 4 here. Hopefully you have some that you can share through the Edmodo group as well, because there are lots of games out there, and we all know that it's so much more fun to learn these things whenever we're actively involved. The flashcards have their place, and we're going to look at those, but probably not as successful as we'd like to be with just using flashcards. So one of the first activities, and again, all these sheets, if you choose the multiplication book, you'll have access to these through the digital download. So rolling for doubles is one. So you can see the sheet here. The folks are going to roll their die or their number cube. They double it, and then they record it on their sheet. They roll 3 times, and the largest sum wins. So we get a little addition practice in here too. We can do that multiple times. I've seen people do it in tournament style, so almost like you might at a game night kind of thing, where you have people moving from table to table based upon who wins, or desk to desk. So you can also try to hit a certain target, and the person closest to that target gets to move on. Doubling up, we'll look at the sheet here in a second. The goal is to be the first to find 6 different products of 2. So you're going to have some dot cards. You're going to pull out the card, jot down the number that associates with that dot card. Remembering that dot cards are powerfully important because they help kids remember that the value is what we're saying when we say 6. It's not this digit 6. That's very abstract, but there's something out there that looks like 6. So anyway, they double that on their game board, but they can only use the product, and the old product can only come out once, right? So they're going to try to get 6 different products. So here are our dot cards. Here's our card. So if I got a 4 in here and I do 4 times 2 gives me 6. Well, now I can't use 4 anymore. So if I pulled 4 again, well, I either lose my turn or we make some classroom rule. And again, if you wanted to make this the highest sum wins, you could make it the closest to a certain value. Again, these are great stations. They don't take any prep really other than getting these initially started. Fact cards, again, they have their place. This is a place that some parents can certainly help. They're great for partners, kids to work together, but it's not a race situation. So generally speaking, when we start introducing speed and time into things, although sometimes we think those have very positive effects, and for a few kids they may, generally they create more anxiety than anything else, and they create a situation where people have the opportunity to quit. Because if I know if after 60 seconds this is over, all I have to do is wait for 60 seconds, right? So to think about those things and what we're doing as well. Our text really pushes personal fact deck cards. So if I'm working on times 6, my deck has all the way through times 6 in it. And if the kid sitting beside me is only working on times 3, his deck would only have times 2 and times 3, or times 0, times 1, times 2, times 3 facts in it. We can still practice together. He's going to quiz me on mine. I'm going to quiz him on his. So it doesn't eliminate us from being able to work together. What it does is just give us practice just on what we need. There is a template in the handouts for that as well. Fact cards can also be used for an activity like this, fact card jumps. So we're going to show on the number line, this one would be times 2s, right? So if I got 4 times 2, I'm going to make 4 jumps of 2 and put that on the number line so I can see that this actually is moving along in a way that I can see. And then we're going to jot down that equation so we remember it in that way as well. Double matchups, right? So we're going to match our addition doubles to their multiplication equation. So we did some of this earlier, right, in one of the activities. So this is a chance for kids to practice that on their own. So we see we've got the matchup cards. So we're seeing the somewhat concrete, at least representational version of the fact. These obviously would be cut apart, and then we're going to match them up. So that you could cut these apart, or you could leave them together and say which one shows 1 plus 1 is 2 and 2 times 1 is 2, and obviously that'd be the first card. So we could be matching them that way. You can make 3 piles, and match the addition, the multiplication. This could be done clearly as a memory game activity, so we're flipping them over and oh, that one doesn't match, this one matches, so can certainly make them more engaging. Whatever we do, we've got to make sure we're monitoring progress. So those fact checks, fact reviews are good. Using multiplication sheets are fine as long as they're individualized. And again, at the end of this PD, we'll talk about how you keep track of that, although you probably have plenty of good ideas. It really isn't as hard to individualize multiplication facts as some people may think. We de-emphasize the importance of time, although we recognize that we don't want to spend 3 minutes on 3 times 2. So there's a certain amount of practice I'm going to do to get fluent, and then I don't need as much practice to remain fluent on that. And we want to make sure we're not competing student against student. Every now and then there are a couple kids who like to do that themselves. That's fine, but really beating your own record should probably be your own personal motivator. As we think about division, the hard part is generally a weakness in division is really revealing a weakness in understanding multiplication. Once I really understand multiplication, I understand the commutative property, the connection to division becomes pretty clear. And I think that's going to be my stance on this, and I think that's our text's stance, is that if we really focus on getting good at multiplication, the connection to division becomes just a question of 2 times what gives me 10, instead of 10 divided by 2 is what, because generally speaking, I think that's the way most of us think about them. Every now and then somebody has really memorized their division facts, and that's how they see them. But usually it's the ability to connect back to multiplication. A couple more examples, right, of connecting back to division. I apologize, I see students is misspelled there. Going back to the manipulatives and going back to texts like 2 of everything. Going back to, well, if he has 10 coins and we know that doubled from something, how many coins did he put in? Now we're working that backwards, right? And so we can see, and we can draw that out. We can have pictures of it. We can also do that with actual concrete objects. That brings us to the end of this session on times 2. And so what I want to do, hopefully, is to make this somewhat purposeful for you. So in your situation, you may say, oh, I'm going to set up these game boards. That's great. And if that's useful to you, go ahead and do that. You may not even need to use them right now. It might be something for next year. It might be something for later in the year. It might be reading the story to a group and doing an activity on it. It might be sharing more strategies in our Edmodo group. What I'm going to do here as I post this video is I'm going to set up an assignment, and all that you need to do in that assignment is post how are you taking what we've looked at today and interpreting it into your practice. So again, are you going to make a game? Are you going to read the story? Are you going to look and investigate some other strategies? If you say to me, I just don't do anything with multiplication, this is just helping me as a parent, that's fine too. I just need to hear from you. And I say thank you for your time, and we'll get the times 10 piece filmed. And I will also tell you that generally speaking, this first one is about the longest one. But I won't promise that for everything because this is just kind of fun. So thanks again for being with us for this time, and I will see you soon.